And so to kick us off, what I would love to do is just introduce ourselves and then just really share a little bit of our why, of why we care so much about diversity and inclusion and how we can really rally around it within our organizations. So with that, I'm going to start off. So Mamta Chabra, I am a marketing lead at UCB. We are headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a hot button state and city within the country. All eyes are in Georgia. And so I'm very excited to be here with this larger team. And so I'll just start off with my why. And why do I care about diversity and inclusion beyond just the very obvious fact that I'm a woman of color? So I'll share with you, I'm the child of immigrants. I grew up in Alabama. And so I didn't truly appreciate what diversity truly meant. And, to me, I didn't really grow up with a lot of people around me who look like me. And so, I grew up in Alabama. I got my engineering degree from Auburn University, huge War Eagle fan of Auburn University, but I took my first job in North Georgia. This was, 20 some years ago now, at Shaw Industries. And it was, I was an engineer by trade at the start, and I was surrounded by white men. That was everyone that was surrounding me in this environment. And so I was interviewing for different roles within different manufacturing facilities. And I'll never forget it. This was 20 years ago, and I was meeting with a VP, who's pretty high up within the organization, clearly. And he says to me, he's like, "Do you really want to be an engineer? You don't look like an engineer." And I remember just receiving that 20 years ago. And, I get emotional just thinking about it, but I remember the 23-year-old self of mine didn't know how to respond to that. And, having grown up in Alabama, having, not really role models that I could see where you could challenge that type of topic. All I wanted in that moment was to be whatever he wanted me to be, right? So that I looked and fit whatever his model of what an engineer was. And so why it matters to me is less about me now, 20 years later. We have so much more work to do. And my hope is that these major biases don't exist, but we all know that they do, and they actually manifest in much more minor ways that we'll talk about today. But why I really care is about the generations behind it. So I have 2 kids, I have a son, I have a daughter, and I want a better future for them. I want them to know that how they look and why they're different is what makes them special and what makes them beautiful. And that's what this world needs. That's what our corporations need. That's how we all become stronger, is because we are different. We bring unique perspectives and backgrounds to our everyday. And I truly strongly believe that how we kind of influence society as a whole is what we do in our homes and our communities. And so I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and learn from this larger team. So with that, Eliot, I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Mamta, I just want to hear you talk more. So that was great. All right. Well, my name's Eliot Francis, and I just want to thank you for having me here, Georgia Bio, the summit, to speak on a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO. And just by way of context, it's the world's largest trade association representing over 1,000 companies, academic institutions, and other related organizations in the life science space. And it ranges from healthcare to agriculture and to the environment. We really advocate for the research and science these organizations bring to patients and consumers globally. The Dni Director Role is a relatively new position, and as I understand it, it's to look particularly through an EDI lens at all that bio does and stands for, to ensure we're having the greatest impact on equity, diversity, and inclusion, not just for our own organization, but also for our member companies, as well as the populations we collectively serve. So the question is why and what fuels me, and just a little bit about me personally. So I'm from New York City and Harlem in particular, and growing up there in the early to middle of the 70s, it was a economically pretty impoverished area, but it's an area that just deep cultural history that I love. But when I was about high school age, my mom, who was a single mom, 5 kids, don't know how she did it, sent all of me and all of our siblings away to boarding school to get a better experience academically. we were smart kids, but unfortunately the environment just didn't lend itself to some of these opportunities. So I traveled about 2.5 hours away to Simsbury, Connecticut, in a very different environment from what I was accustomed to in Harlem, a very white, a very affluent area. And so now I was in the truest sense of what a racial ethnic minority was. But believe it or not, that wasn't the greatest shock for me. The greatest shock for me was the socioeconomic disparity between me and the kids that I went to school with. They literally had the means, these children and their families, to do whatever it is their hearts and minds desired. And I didn't come from that. They didn't understand no, they didn't understand obstacles, and I did. The issue, and there was a lot of, it was a really interesting experience, some good, some not so good. There was prejudice, there was discrimination, there was all that stuff there. But what was most interesting to me was that there was a dominant culture at this institution, and it supported people who were affiliated with that dominant culture, which tended to be white students who had good, wealth, had wealth, their families had wealth. And I wasn't part of that. There was a small minority of us that came from outside and came to this environment, and we were expected to assimilate into the culture, and there was just a tremendous amount of friction there and challenges, as you would imagine. But rather than become jaded by the experience, I embraced it and took the opportunity to learn more about myself. I learned that the institution, the faculty, the staff, the board of directors were ill prepared to help people like myself um, participate and become a part of the culture without having to assimilate. That carried on into my academic work and my collegiate experience, just studying human institutions, and then my professional work, both in the private and public sector, around equity, diversity, and inclusion, helping leaders really understand the importance of what inclusion means, not just having a dominant culture and expecting employees or people who come into an organization to assimilate, but more how do we embrace them for all the dimensions of diversity that they bring to the table, but then actively engaging them to be a part of decision making and creating a culture that would be embracing of all people. So that's why I do this work. I love this work, and really drawing on that early experience is what's kind of catalyzed me to do this work throughout. So thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Eliot. Moray?
I don't know how I followed that up. I mean, that was amazing. Hello, everyone. I'm coming from the West Coast, so right outside of San Francisco. My name is Murray Rasmussen, and I work for CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion by way of PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers. I am one of the core leaders for CEO Action for Racial Equity, which is a fellowship that was brought together to fight systemic racism and social injustice in our country through public policy change. Them together to take the business community and actually getting them engaged and involved in what's happening in our country. I have been with PwC for 22 years, spent 17 of those years working in the DE&I space, overseeing the strategic vision for diversity, equity, inclusion for the entire West region of PricewaterhouseCoopers. I have a CPA background, but please do not hold that against me. Because I am extremely passionate about diversity and inclusion. My personal why, I think it was a little bit of two reasons. I fell into this. I was a single mother when I started working at PwC. So I was one of those people that were told when I was growing up that, I'd never be able to work for, at that time, a big six accounting firm because I was married and had kids. And then when I had loved it, got my background in accounting, and I was actually working with a PwC accounting team at a utility company, and they kept trying to recruit me. And I kept saying, well, I was told I'd never be successful at your company. That's that's not what you could do if you're married and single because you guys work too much. And they kept saying, come on, we want you. So I joined on, thinking I'd stay there for a few years and then get a taste of what it is and leave. And lo and behold, I found that I was actually good at it. And I was actually pretty much a trailblazer, being a single mom at that time, because I had gotten divorced in the during the interim, being a single mom and actually working in the utility side of the house, if you can recall how crazy it was with Enron and all of that. So we were putting in numerous hours, but I was able to make it work. And my boss came to me one day and said, how can you help other parents do this work so that we don't lose that aspect of our business, of our people? And that's kind of how I fell into it, for doing it from the inside. How I fell into CEO Action for Racial Equity is a little bit different. My personal side of this and why it's important is my grandfather served in World War II. And when he came back into this country after he left the military, he wasn't allowed to get a loan to buy a house. He wasn't allowed to do the work that he was trained to do in the military. And he ended up in his years of fighting the system in Cleveland, Ohio, he ended up being one of the first Black men to own a real estate business, and one of the first Black men in the city to own a grocery store chain, for the Black and African American community within the city of Cleveland. So way he was actually given a letter of accommodation from the mayor, because of the hard work that he did in the support of the community. My father was born in Selma, Alabama, and actually marched in that Bloody Sunday March, with legends like, Martin Luther King and John Lewis. And he never told us until 2 years before he died, because he just didn't feel that it was something that he wanted us to carry on. He wanted us to believe that this country was okay for everyone. And when he told us that, it actually, I have 7 younger brothers, so there's 8 of us. It actually put a little bit of a change in our vision of what we wanted, and what we hoped for, because we didn't realize that we had someone who actually was in that fight. And then my mom's husband, my stepfather, was actually the CEO and founder of the California Black Chamber of Commerce, and sat on the and worked with the Black Caucus in our capital to actually create uh, create a better economic space for Black and African Americans in this country, and especially here serving in the state of California. So when I say I fell into it, I truly mean that, because I kept running the other direction and saying I wanted to be an accountant. I wanted to be an accountant. That's what I want to do. And somehow I kept getting pulled back into this space. Um, and now there's no way I'd ever turn back. I love this work. I've been doing it for, like I said, a little over 17 years. And I have big shoulders that I'm standing on, and I have big shoes to fill. And my mission in life is to make them proud. So that's my why.
Thank you, Moray. That was powerful. Nancy?
Thank you, Mamta. And it's always tough to be the last one when I'm preceded by such esteemed colleagues and great stories. I'm Nancy Dadia. I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Boehringer Ingelheim. And I have been doing this work since the early 90s. I started my career, I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Very much raised in a lower middle income type of family, second generation Italian. My parents spoke Italian at home to keep things from me, and I soon quickly learned how to study Italian. So I knew that at the end they were really talking about the neighbors and didn't want me to know about it. But the long story is my years in financial services and my years growing up with a very strict, very conservative type of father, being the youngest daughter of 2, uh, also was very limited in his views on the world and people. And as I grew as a product of the New York City school system, I began to see a lot of disparities, even at a very young age. And I always found myself wanting to socialize with the minority or the underrepresented or the only child of color in my class. I am a child of the 60s, and as I spent most of my career, more than 30 years now, in the corporate world, I had a variety of the good, the bad, and the ugly, from good managers to bad managers to managers I hope I can forget about someday. And during that time, I also was coming out personally as a gay female, and I did not feel comfortable in my workplace to do that. So this sense of belonging for me has always been very measured, and up until probably 20 years ago when I did come out in the workplace. So my life's work is really about creating not just a culture where you can be your authentic self, but also about standing up for the underdog, right, or the underserved. And so I'm passionate about healthcare disparities and ensuring people get the medicines that they need. I'm passionate about people who don't have the privileges that I have grown and earned to live with through my life, knowing what it's like to not have privilege, or I should say, financial equity, or in my life. So I do this because I do believe we're making a difference one person at a time. I have faith in the human race, and I have faith in all of us here that we want to be part of the change that we need to see in our country and in our own communities. So that's why I do this. It brings me joy, and it is who I am.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And Nancy, I think you really brought it home around, being courageous enough to have those very difficult conversations and confronting the realities when you see them happening to truly see change. So with that, I'm going to ask Murray. I mean, I think something that I've seen in your background is that CEO action centers around some pledge commitments. And one of those pledge commitments centers all around how do you cultivate trust within the organization so that you can really confront these difficult conversations that larger organizations may struggle with, but smaller size ones may even find it more difficult. So what have you found that has worked with stakeholders, and what learnings can you share with our team today?
First of all, great question, but I want to back up a little bit because I'm not sure how many people on the call today know what CEO action is. So just to give a little bit of insight to CEO Action is the largest coalition of CEOs with over 1,400 CEOs who have signed a commitment pledge to do one of four things. They said that they would create a workplace that was comfortable enough to have uncomfortable conversations. They would roll out unconscious bias training or diversity training. They would share actions that are working within their organizations, and better yet, even share actions that aren't working. And then they would take their diversity strategy and share with their board of directors. The overarching premise of CEO Action is to create a space of collaboration and not about competition. Because if you recall, most companies up until this particular coalition kind of started, they used DE&I and what they were doing in DE&I as a way to show as a competitive edge, right? Let me share what we're doing so that you'll come work for us. Let me share what you're doing so you can see how great we are, right? Our steering committee, which consists of 20 CEOs, said they wanted to remove that layer of competition and really create a space where CEOs can come together, talk about what's working, talk about what isn't working, learn from each other, be supporters of each other, almost harnessing that power of these organizations to be able to move the needle in the fight against and to create better workplaces. we have companies, CEOs who've signed on from companies like Hershey's and P&G to smaller companies. So we have universities and universities like Boston, Boston College, University of Penn State, to very small colleges like Gettysburg College. We have major not-for-profits like United Way Worldwide, all the way to smaller not-for-profits. So we're 1,400 strong, and we're just 3 years and 6 months in the making. And we started because of those 10 CEOs came together and said, what can we do after the murders of Alton Sterling and Tamir Rice and the shootings of the police officers in Dallas, Texas, back in 2016? They wanted to know, what could CEOs have a bigger voice in creating this idea of inclusion and belonging and equity within the four walls, and how can they do that by sharing what's working? So your question around what can smaller organizations do for diversity and inclusion, because we've got resources available for these organizations that can take them off the shelf, roll them out within the organizations, deliver them. We have social media assets, but even in a bigger picture, when you talk about how to create this idea of inclusion within the workplace, I think it really starts with, thinking about the mission and the vision of your organization. You know, you can't look at creating an inclusive environment if it isn't actually embedded into the mission of what your company is about, of who you, your people purpose. What's your purpose? PwC, we changed from a mission statement to a purpose statement because we wanted our people to really build their own personal values into the purpose of what we're trying to do. And our purpose statement became to build trust in society and solve important problems. And our societies can be defined by the four walls of within the organization. So thinking truly about your mission, your vision, your purpose, your processes, if you can't think about if you're not looking at D&I through that lens, it's going to be really difficult to create an inclusive environment within your organization, because you're actually going to be going up against the walls of what what your people mission is about within your organization. So I say it really starts there. I think some ways that companies have been doing it is looking at their human capital, what their human capital strategy is, right? So thinking about their recruiting strategy, thinking about their development strategy, thinking about their pipeline strategy, looking at those processes. I think when you looking at your, especially when it comes to pipelines and your strategy within your business units, it's really important just to think about how you can embed D&I into those areas before you start going out and having these conversations, because you can't start having the conversations and people are going to buy into the conversations if your structure is not even set up to actually implement what comes out of those honest conversations, if that makes sense.
Right, I think you make a really great point, and I think at my organization UCB, we have taken this as an objective and a key mission, and sometimes it can feel like within the organization it's just a checkbox, and I feel like when there's actually leadership that's living those everyday values and how they behave, it transforms an organization. So I'll give you an example. After the murder of George Floyd, the president of our company got on a call with us just to say, listen, I don't have all the answers, but I'm here to listen to you, right? And I think that's all that we need sometimes, is just to be courageous enough to say, I don't know the answers here, but I'm here to support you and I'm here to listen. And I think just extending that, opens the doors for true, vulnerable, honest conversations. And that's how we all grow and get stronger together.
And Mom, to that, that's a really good point. And the hard part of that is that, being grounded in your mission helps drive that, right? So even your leadership can say, I'm here to listen. And if the people and the employees within the organization to give feedback, right, and say, hey, this is where I'm struggling, this is what is challenging. If it's not, if you can't go back to, this is what we believe in, if you can't go back to your mission and say, this is what we believe in, this is what we support, and this is what's driving us, then it's going to be very difficult to make that shift and change, and for your employees to truly believe what you're saying, right? So absolutely, it starts with the top, it starts with leadership, but it really starts at also looking at your mission and values of your organization, because everything begins to point back to that.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Eliot, do you have anything to add here? Any personal story, anecdote?
I do. Holy cow. I've been taking some notes here because Moray and Mamta, I mean, the things you said really resonate with me. And I just want to emphasize a few points in agreement, really. And so, what I've seen in my experience a lot doing this DNI work with leaders is um, they have trouble sometimes knowing where to start. What do we do? And I've tried to really position it to them as looking at this as a journey. It's not necessarily a destination that you're trying to get to. And I caution them against that because when you focus so much on the destination may be, I want X amount of women, I want X amount of Hispanics and people of color, Black people, whatever dimension of diversity is. And while that can be good in some respects, that shouldn't be the ultimate goal. What I try to get them to focus on is making sure that they're focusing on the journey part of becoming in an inclusive environment. Diversity and dimensions of diversity evolve. When I was growing up, there were really two genders. That's it, male and female. Now you obviously see the spectrum. It's you have non-binary. It's more fluid. Identity evolves no matter what dimension of diversity it is. If your organization is structured in a way that can be inclusive and continues to develop its cultural understanding of these different groups, then you'll be in a better position to serve these populations in your organization and give them a place to actively participate, to be engaged, and to Nancy's point earlier, to feel a sense of belonging, right? And so I think I heard Moray say something about trust. Oh my gosh, such a huge issue, right? And to me, it's actually a pretty simple formula. Trust, it's doing what you say you're going to do over time. Now, the overtime period, that's the variable, right? It depends. But leaders of an organization and organizations themselves need to be committed to building trust, not just with the workforce, but with the population externally that we support or we serve. The other point I want to make, which I thought was phenomenal with what Moray said. So again, I'm new to bio. I've only been here for about 8 months. So the first 3 months was me going around doing a listening tour. All right. I don't want to come in and say, okay, we need to do this, we need to do that, and da da da. That's just irresponsible. I have no context. I have no background. I have no relationships or rapport built. So I don't have the ear to the street. I don't have the finger on the pulse. So the first 3 months was just doing that assessment, talking to people, getting a sense of the culture, right? But what I did notice at Bio was that we were preaching to our member companies about what they should be doing on diversity and inclusion, how they should diversify their boards, and all this other good stuff, which is true and it makes sense and it's the right thing to do. But what I realized was that we didn't necessarily have a coordinated effort internal to our organization to make sure that we could exemplify what we're preaching to all of our constituents and partners to do. And so we needed to be authentic, right? And the way you become authentic is say, well, we need a coordinated effort to make sure that our culture makes us the employer of choice for all these reasons, right? When we start looking at our systems, and Moray brought this up too, when you think about your human capital employee or life cycle from recruitment to onboarding to, advancement and development to training, succession planning to when you ultimately separate from the organization, how are we looking at all of our systems and that cycle, right, from an EDI lens, through an EDI lens? Are there certain populations that are not ascending at the same rate as others? Maybe there's some inequity there, maybe there's some bias there. We wouldn't know unless we're looking at the data and then making some type of adjustments. We want to make sure that our culture exemplifies everything that we talk about from an equity, diversity, and inclusion standpoint. So then when we go out and talk to organizations, we can speak from a place of truth. And I wanted to make this clear to the leadership at Bio also. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We don't have to appear like we have it all great. We are on a journey. And if we share that journey from a place of transparency, I think it shows a connection. Like, yes, we've identified some issues that we need to fix. We're working on them. We can do it together. We're building, but we're trending in the right direction because we know that this is an evolutionary process. So, just some of my initial thoughts. I'm loving this conversation. I know even after this panel, I'm going to stay in contact with you all and just share ideas, thoughts, and concepts. And I'm sure together we can do so much more.
I love it, Elliot. I think what you truly touched on was around how us being vulnerable truly builds that culture of trust that we're trying to infuse within the organization. So thank you for sharing that. Nancy, I'd love to get your take and your perspective of learnings.
Well, you always put me in a precarious situation. It's tough to go after these two.
You always do a great job, Nancy.
It's tough, when you put me up to the competition here. No, seriously, there are a couple of things that I think are really crucial around values. And Murray talked about purpose and your why and what inspires you. But all of us as institutions, as organizations, have values. And those values, I know at Beringer Ingelheim, are really simple. And they're founded in empathy, respect, trust, and passion. And if you look at that, in terms of what we're experiencing, and I call it the trifecta of conflict this year between the pandemic, the intersection of work and life and work. Right now, you're in my study, right? My office. We're in people's homes, and there are no more boundaries, right? So I think the challenge is that our reaction is to want to fix things. To Eliot's point, this is a journey. And a lot of times where we see leaders get hung up is they're not accustomed to not having a solution because they're wired to come to the table with a solution and how to fix it. This is not changing the light bulb and all the brightness will come back. This is beyond a journey. It's revolutionary, it's evolutionary, and it's a moment in time where our world, I hope, has become woke and aware of that what got us here won't get us to where we need to be. And that's a better place, a better country, right? A better organization that creates that space for people no longer to fit in, but to belong. Because there's a big difference when we talk about people fitting in and we have leaders at our leadership tables saying things, well, Nancy's not a great fit. And when I hear things like that, and when I've heard things like that throughout my career, that implies to me that there isn't much appetite for diversity. That means you want me to assimilate and be like you, which is why we're trying. It's very hard, right? We talked about your brain being wired a certain way. It's why we're trying to move away from terms like fit rather than using something like, hey, Eliot would be a great add to our culture, don't you think? And Moray's experience would just bring such an asset to our business, as opposed to saying Moray's not the right fit or a good fit. And I think when we start moving away from this mindset of, even if you think about memojis, right? It's creating people that look like you and think like you. So I think a big part of our work as chief DEI officers is really about coaching leaders to be their better selves.
Thank you for sharing that,
Okay,
Nancy.
she just closed that really well.
Totally,
So see, Nancy,
totally.
you
I was
just round us out.
gonna say.
Sure did.
Totally.
Well, thank you. You're so kind. Thank you.
And Nancy, you touched on something that I'd love to probe a little bit more on. I mean, I think the aspect of you being in senior leadership, I think it would be really help serve us to understand how do you get your peers to really prioritize these activities and priorities, and so that it becomes a mainstay, right, within our culture, and it's not considered trendy like it has been of the past, but it truly fuels long-term change within an organization.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I don't know if this is the magic bullet, but I've been doing this work for a long time, and I do find that personal one-on-one interaction with my peers in a private space, virtual space, whatever it is, where they uh, where they have that trust in me, where they can be vulnerable and ask the questions that they know their colleagues are asking, but they don't want to ask that in public. And knowing that I'm going to be able to support them and be that upstander, if you will, that allyship, where I'm going to perhaps give them some strategies on what they can do differently and what they should do differently. And this past week, I can't tell you the number of executives that have reached out to me about what's going on in the country and not really knowing how to have these conversations. And even, after even in general, we've had 18 courageous conversations in our company since the murder of George Floyd, right? And I've invited my colleagues, my senior leaders, to join me. I've had 18 of them, and there's a line. They want to come and join and hear what employees are saying. And once they are in a space where they feel comfortable, they start continuing these conversations back in their businesses. So I think the immersion part of putting them in in the middle of what traditionally used to be called the undiscussables or the hard stuff is the only, and I'm not saying I'm throwing them in the deep end of the pool without, a lifeline. What I am saying is they have dealt with, in my view, very hard business decisions, and they don't think that they can do this. And I think that as people, we don't give ourselves enough credit about our resiliency and what we're capable of doing. And all of them are more than likely in those roles because of their resiliency, because of what they can do. And the more that we're able to pull that shade away from their own inner fears, the more comfortable they become in being uncomfortable. And I think that's the key, and that the last piece, which I mentioned before, is that we've got to get them moving away that nobody's expecting you to fix this. You can't solve this problem. It's way bigger than you. It's way bigger than the company. But the fact that you're going to show up and listen in a way that's going to show that empathy, and I mean genuinely, not in a way where you're multitasking, but that you're fully dedicated to hearing the other side is what matters. And of course, all the fundamentals, having a priority that is specific with metrics or a goal around this commitment, having your CEO hold his or her leaders accountable for, yeah, I'm going to do diversity work. But what exactly are you going to do? Or I'm going to make things more equitable. How are you going to do that? I can give you an example quickly of one of our leaders who actually decided that he had some blockage in opportunities in his organization. And what did he do? He opened up more positions, right, to create more rotations, not necessarily adding headcount, but he also set up roundtables for the people, especially the BIPOC colleagues, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that don't normally get to sit at his table, to come in and talk to him. And I didn't tell him to do this. This was his sense of how he could better connect. And I think once you open up the door, people are smart. These folks got there for good reason. And I just wish that they were more confident in their abilities to be the great leaders that they are.
That's incredible work you're doing, Nancy. So thank you for sharing that. And I love the aspect that you said about just having one-on-one meetings with them, right? Where people, and you create space for them to be vulnerable and honest, because leaders oftentimes, we forget they're human too, right? And they're used to always
Exactly.
having the answers and fixing things, and creating that space, I can imagine, creates ripples within your organization.
Well, thank you, Mabda.
Thank you for sharing.
Can I add something to that? Because I think, you know, as D&I experts, you know, Nancy's absolutely correct. We can't do our work without having those relationships, because this is tough work. Everybody's coming at it from a different perspective. You know, my almost 20 years doing this, I believe that everybody is looking at things from the head, the heart, or the wallet. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, but you know, you've got to recognize right off the bat who you're speaking to and where their perspective is, right? If they're looking at it from the headspace, they're about the numbers, they're about the direction of the company. And most of us who get into this work are doing it because we're passionate about the work, that there's something personal that we are connected to that's driving that. We also have to recognize that some of our leaders, some of our peers that we are talking to may not have and feel that same passion. Doesn't mean that they're not going to move the needle with us, doesn't mean that they're not going to invest in this direction with us, but we've got to give them the reason why, and we've got to know if it's coming from their head, and we've got to talk to them in that language. If it's coming from the heart, like us, man, that's an easy conversation, right? That's like everybody's like, yeah, we need to do this. But if it's coming from the wallet, we got to shift our conversation, because for them, it's about the money. I'll be 100% transparent with everyone here. I don't care what direction they're coming from, right? I know how to shift my language to get them to do what needs to be done to make our organization better. Because at the end of the day, that's what we all want. We want to have a better workplace for everyone. So you know, doing this work, you got to know where you're going, because if you're talking to someone that's not in there, it's not resonating with them, you're going to be hitting your head up against the wall, and you're going to get frustrated really, really quick.
And I think that's a really important point, right? To adapt your style to the audience that's going to receive it, so that, you know, your mission, you can still deliver against your mission, and they're hearing you, like truly hearing you, versus just background noise. So thank you for sharing that. So Eliot, I want you to help us close with telling us a little bit more about this bio report that was issued around diversity and inclusion. What sort of big aha moments did you have, and what sort of applications have you seen in the real world?
Yeah, thank you for that. And boy, there's so many things that I want to comment on based on what Nancy said and what Moray said. We'll just have to do this again.
We'll do a happy hour.
Yeah, we'll just have to do this again. And one of the reasons why the energy is so good here in this conversation, and this speaks to what Moray said, from speaking from the head, the heart of the wallet, I think all of us are speaking from the heart. We have a personal connection to this work, which is why we're so passionate and dedicated to it, and we put our energies behind it. What I didn't say earlier in my introduction, and this is kind of to Mamta's point, I have two young children, two beautiful Black young children growing up in this world. And what I'm passionately concerned about is making sure that they can truly love who they are, and that they can understand that their experience in life will be full and can be appreciated, and that they shouldn't shy away or dampen their spirit because they need to fit in somewhere. So this this whole notion around cultural fit, or this person's not the right fit for some reason, that's just coded language, right? That's coded language for, we want somebody to come in and just continue to placate what we've created. Anyway, this report that Bio has developed, and thank you again for bringing this up. So we do a survey, an annual survey. Data is important. Um, Data, when you think about demographic data in the workforce, in the industry, and not just the demographic breakdown, but also data around what employee perceptions are on how they feel the organization is, with regard to being inclusive, their sense of belonging, if they feel they're a part of decisions that impact the direction or the future of the organization. Collecting data is king, right? We think about the biotech space. We don't develop, our member companies and other companies in this space, they don't develop any therapeutics or diagnostics or vaccines that would benefit the population without looking at data and having some type of process in place to make sure that they're successful, clinical trials and so on and so forth. Why should approaching equity, diversity, and inclusion be any different? What I've seen in my history of doing this work is sometimes organizations just do a bunch of sporadic, sparse things with regard to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and it's activity, and they're like, hey, we're doing this, we're doing that. Why isn't anything working? Well, it's not a part of a coordinated approach. You wouldn't do that for development of a particular drug that will benefit a population. Why is this any different? And back to Moray's point earlier, it should be connected to the mission, the business outcomes of the organization. That's how you make sure you be successful, right? It's not a standalone, separate, sparse activity. It's connected to the direction, the goals, and the values of the organization itself. This data that we collect, and we're looking to expand our data set to make sure we get a real pulse on what's happening in the industry. Now, I have a few statistics that I want to share from the report that came out earlier this year based on the survey that was done last year. And currently, I'll just say, currently we are administering the second survey right now. So we hope to expand on the data that we've collected. But a few highlights. So the Latinx population comprises 5% of total employees, but only 3% of executives and 3% of board members. For the Black population, they comprise only about 4% of the total employees, but only 1% of executives and 1% of board members. Asians, including Indians, have a higher representation of both these groups. Notably, that came out in the study, 12% of organizations say they have no people of color on staff. Now, mind you, these again are the member companies in our organization, in our space, that have responded to this survey itself. And we have organizations of different sizes, some very small, pre-revenue stage, and some that are massive, but the large majority are small to mid-size. Also, 80% of respondents indicated that employees demonstrate commitment to creating an inclusive work environment at their organization. That's pretty good. 16% of companies have goals to promote or develop women, and 12% of companies have goals to promote or develop people of color, while only 11% have incorporated diversity targets or goals for women, including into their hiring processes, and 10% for people of color. It's a lot of data, and there's many, many more statistics. But what this tells me, as I said earlier, this is a journey. This just gives us a benchmark as to where we are, and then determine sort of where we need to go. One thing that I've been doing over the last couple months is we have representatives in the state, the geographic locations, our state affiliates that we work with quite a bit. And these are CEOs of biotech companies, and they have member companies and boards that they work along with also. And there's just been this groundswell and interest around creating equity, diversity, and inclusion strategic plans in the various regions. I'm connecting with them to make sure that if there's potential synergies, we can work together on some of these efforts. But what I'm hearing again, and I made this point earlier, is a lot of them don't know where to start, or they've been doing some things and not really yielding the types of results in this space that they would like to. So my conversations with them are trying to simplify it, really harnessing what I saw in the data in the report. But I boil it down to three simple questions for them. First question is, where are you currently? You just need to assess where you are. And that's what I did at Bio when I came on board. Do we have a coordinated approach? to equity, diversity, and inclusion? Is it tied to the mission and the outcome of the organization? Are we tracking data, right? This employee life cycle and demographically? And are we getting employee perceptions on how they feel about the organizations? If not, that's a great place to start. That baselines our understanding, and then we'll determine where we need to go. That's the next question. Where do you want to go? You don't want to answer that until you know where you are on the journey, right? And so where you want to go, that's where you do the strategic planning, the visioning on what it looks like. 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, what do you want to stand for as an organization, and what do you want to look like? Internal, your culture, and externally, what type of impact do you want to have? The last question, and arguably it's the most important, is the how do we intend to get there? And that's your resource planning. Just like any good
Eliot,
project.
sorry to cut you off. I think
Yep.
we're going to get cut off. So
Okay.
I'm really sorry. I was really enjoying this, but I'm getting the nudge to move forward. So I just wanted to take this moment to really thank Eliot, Nancy, Moray for all your valuable lessons here. I think, Eliot, what we'll leave with is this is just the beginning of the journey that we're in this together. And I want this to continue with our local team, but then I want our audience members to really start these journeys and these difficult conversations where they are within their organizations. So thank you everyone for your time, and I really appreciate it. And let's keep in touch, guys.
Yes, definitely. Thank you all. Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.